am excited to invite our next speaker to the stage. I think he's been to the summit a few times before and spoken to us, Gabe Collins. He is the Baker Botts Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at the Baker Institute at Rice University. That's a mouthful. I do not want to know what acronym that would form. He recently published a paper on overruling the rule of capture, something that obviously is very central in Texas groundwater law, and how that's played out in other states, what Texas might learn from that experience. We're pleased to have him here to share that work. Let's welcome Gabe.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me here, and thank you to all of you for coming and being here this afternoon. So I think my topic may be the first of the day that puts somebody at risk of being the skunk at the party, but I think there's another mustelid species that I'm going to channel here, and that one's the honey badger, because I know I'm sticking my head into a bit of a beehive, and if I absorb a few stings along the way, that's fine. And looking forward to our discussion here. Basically, with this analysis here, what we're really looking at is what's the fundamental policy objective that we want to go after? And what this is really about is dynamism, resilience, and water security for Texas, looking as far out as 2100. Certainly when I approach this work, I come at this with a very West Texas mindset, the environment I was brought up in, where when you're thinking about water, you're thinking 50 or 75 years ahead, maybe sometimes even a little bit more. Insofar as how I went about starting to try to address this question, and this is an evolving body of work, it's huge and it's complex, and I'm going to get more feedback along the way that this will evolve, but basically I've drawn upon dozens of judicial and legislative decisions taken in 10 other states that at various points over the last 150 years have transitioned from the rule of capture to some other type of groundwater common law doctrine. These states are Arkansas, Arizona, California, Florida, Kansas, Michigan, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Ohio, and Oklahoma. We chose this cross-section because it offers a blend of, I think, unique and cross-jurisdictional insights that will give a more informed basis for policymakers in Texas should they choose to update the state's groundwater common law. Now, I'm going to try to target this for 20 to 25 minutes today, and this is probably your good fortune. So we're just going to focus on 3 of the states. We're going to focus on Ohio, on Michigan, and on Nebraska. I think Ohio and Michigan are relevant. Each has adopted either explicitly the Restatement Second, which is basically an equitable balancing approach, or a common law version of that is basically the Restatement Second approach in everything but name. Nebraska, it's a little bit narrower, but I think still very relevant for Texas, insofar as they've actually adopted the Restatement Second approach to manage conflicts between hydrologically connected groundwater and surface water users. So our star of the show today, the rule of capture, in my mind, it's high time to think about reforming this rule, which finds itself anachronistic and out of step with the rapidly evolving demographic, economic, and hydrological realities of our great state. Robert and Roel touched in a very good way on many of these earlier. I'll layer in a few more things with some data, and then we'll jump to the states in question. But basically, this has been the law of the land here in Texas for almost 120 years now, and it's fundamentally based on principles that were developed in Rome over 1,000 years ago, and so it's not new. The Texas Supreme Court, as you see here, basically describes it as a doctrine of non-liability. If you and I are next to each other, unless I'm doing a very small subset of things that I think in practice are almost impossible to prove in court, for instance, trying to maliciously cause your land to subside, pretty much outside of those precious few cases, I could pump as much water as I want, even if it's being drained from under your land. You're not going to have recourse. Now, when we think about the forcing functions for groundwater law modernization, and again, this is in most states, if you think about the rule of capture's first few decades here in Texas, it was formally adopted by the Texas Supreme Court in 1904. it often did work in an acceptable fashion. What really changed is starting in the 1930s, we saw the proliferation of powerful turbine pumps, and also, and part of this, these were New Deal programs, a big push for rural electrification and better access to energy sources that actually allowed these pumps to be used. This is when we saw groundwater withdrawals really accelerate. And I think it's not a coincidence that if you look nationwide, between 1930 and 1980, almost half of states here in the US affirmatively abandoned the rule of capture for something better suited to manage groundwater under conditions where you have an increasingly large set of more powerful straws tapping into that resource. Now, just to give you a brief overview here of some of these governance systems is basically we have correlative rights. This is the law of the land in California. I probably should reshade Nebraska as well. I have it as American rule. I think it's probably more accurately correlative rights for groundwater. But this is basically something where under normal conditions, it is a doctrine of non-liability until you start doing something that affects your neighbors, or there's something that at a macro level induces a shortage of water supplies, and then you start to see proportional cutbacks so that different users will have a fair opportunity to access what's remaining of the resource to meet their needs. You have the English rule, or rule of capture, which Texas and a few other states, generally ones that are wetter than us hydrologically or meteorologically speaking, adhere to. And then you have the restatement second approach, which has been formally adopted in Ohio and Wisconsin. It's basically adopted in Michigan in all but name. And then you have the states that manage by either prior appropriation or some type of administrative permitting system. Most of the prior appropriation states for groundwater are generally the ones in the Rocky Mountain region in the American West. The two outliers that are in wet areas that still use a permit-based system would be Florida and also South Carolina. Now, as we think about some of the circumstances here that we're dealing with, and a few of these slides we'll move through more quickly because I think Robert and Roel have already set them up very well. But if we think about how things have changed since the rule of capture was adopted, we're not a stranger to these challenges. We saw a strong upswing first in water use. We started seeing springs dry out all over the state. We have Texas Water Development Board reports from as early as 1975 that document this in a fairly comprehensive way. We saw an upswing in disputes between groundwater users. And again, this closely followed the deployment of bigger pumps, rural electrification, and some of the other things that enabled high volume access to groundwater. But I think the difference here is, unlike most other states, including basically actually all of our neighbors except for Louisiana, our common law hasn't evolved to keep pace with these technological, economic, and demographic changes. And so I think the first one here, if we look at demographics, is you look at the time period on the far left-hand part of this chart between 1900 and 1910 when the rule of capture was adopted by the Supreme Court. Less than half of Texas's population was in what I call the core urban growth engines. And basically the way I define this are metropolitan statistical areas that, if we look at them today, have 250,000 or more people living in them. And what you can see over the subsequent 100 to 120 years is we're now at a point where 85% of Texans live in these core metro statistical areas. And these are basically the big metros of the Texas Triangle, the populous parts of the Valley, Laredo, Bryan College Station, the Waco area, Amarillo, Lubbock, and El Paso. And what we see over really the last 20 or 30 years is just an acceleration of this. And I think water use starts to follow this. And I think that the other thing that this really brings to the fore is, if you look at the economic juggernaut we've built here in Texas, it's about a $1.8 trillion a year economy now. This is an economy that's on par with the size of Canada's. We'd be among the world's 10 largest as a standalone entity. And water underpins this growth, even if it's sometimes an afterthought. Now, when we think about the economic value generated per gallon of water used, the simplest way to think about it, and I basically used a base 10 logarithm scale for this chart because you're moving an order of magnitude between each of the big subsets of uses. At the low end of the curve, you have agriculture. You're talking often thousandths of a cent per gallon of water used in direct economic value generated. If you start moving into manufacturing, you look at steel production. Here I use a Ford Focus. Probably for Texas, a Toyota Tundra or Tacoma would be better. Comparison south of San Antonio, but they haven't disclosed the data for the calculation. But it's going to be in the ballpark where you're getting into tens of cents of value generated per gallon of water used. And then if you start stepping up into some of the higher value things, you look at, for instance, fracking for oil and gas. You look at semiconductor and electronics manufacturing, which especially for the Austin area is an increasingly important area. There your multiplier goes up again by a huge leap. You're talking multiple dollars. And then if you want the king here, I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you want to visit from the DEA, but I actually ran the numbers if you were growing poppies and taking it all the way to morphine and selling it. And that one you can generate pretty good returns on your water, but maybe not such a great idea, legally speaking. Now, in terms of thinking about how water underpins growth, I think Texas really has two second mover advantages here. The first second mover advantage is one that's very core to this talk today, and that's the ability to look at other states' legal and legislative experiences. They made the transition, but I think we also have the benefit almost in real time now of having a second mover position to see what can go wrong when you don't have adequate water supplies to underpin growth. And this is something that isn't just a Western states issue. If you look here at the image I've put up, basically the left-hand side, that is a Western states issue. That's Utah. That's a reservoir up in the mountains east of Salt Lake City where you have the city of Oakley has actually basically had to put a halt to issuing new home permits and further growth because they just don't have the water to feed these places. And this is something that's elapsed fairly quickly. You're talking a 3 to 5 year time frame. But if you want to look to an environment that in precipitation terms is even wetter than the part of Texas we're in now and probably more closely approximates Houston, that is South Carolina, where even in that very humid environment, we're seeing groundwater related conflicts emerge. Google's at the center of this one. They have a big data center, and running all those servers, you need a lot of cooling water. And they've actually been pulling an aquifer hard enough there that it's created local disputes, and they're still trying to reach a resolution to that. And to kind of give you a sense of this and why we should be concerned about it in the Texas context is, we've been working very hard, I think, as a state, and the COVID pandemic's accelerated this. We want to attract businesses from California and other places that have a less operationally friendly regime. But at the end of the day, there's a couple of things other than a good political environment that you need for that. You need electricity and you need water. And if these things become something that's more than just an afterthought to a business planner, you've started to erode our competitiveness because these businesses could site all throughout the country. And so it's, I think, something that really deserves attention and, again, makes it very worthwhile to raise the question of, is it time now to update our groundwater common law? The other thing to think about, I think Robert alluded to this in his remarks, maybe in a slightly different way, is, when you think about both Texas has existed before and especially a more populous, economically larger, and potentially even more manufacturing and other non-natural resource business oriented Texas moving forward is, and climate change layered on top of this, water supply reliability, groundwater is going to be the flywheel that underpins that system. You think about an engine trying to run without a flywheel, you're going to get one or two ignition cycles and that engine blows itself apart. Groundwater is what balances us here. And as evidence of that, if you look at the poll on groundwater during the 2011 drought, and then you look at the big dip in groundwater usage during 2015 when we had so much rain during the spring and summer. I think it really brings this point home. And I think, I don't have the data to run this for the 1950s, but my guess is if we juxtaposed a 1950s type of drought onto the current incarnation of Texas, these moves would potentially be even more stark, and they would be sustained over a much longer period of time. And you'd be talking easily tens of millions of acre feet of volume, something that would be equal to a material portion of all the reservoirs we have in the state. So where this brings us is, how do we think about updating this operating system? We know that if operating systems aren't periodically updated, the technology, the things you're trying to run with it tend to not work as well. I think one thing that's really critical to bear in mind here is, as we consider this in a Texas context, is the common law is not something that's static. I think there's times when, and probably the more people deal with lawyers, the more they think we're a force, from time to time for stasis and not changing things. But the reality is the body of common law that we're all steeped in is designed to evolve. It's really something that is premised on a logic that can and arguably should be updated when conditions change. It's not just a static code of rules meant for all eternity and all conditions. And as we look at how one state did this, I think Ohio is perhaps the closest example, just in pure legal genetic terms, for Texas. And it's not an accident that I snuck a DNA double helix in there, because if you look at the East decision that made the rule of capture our groundwater common law here in Texas, they quoted massive chunks verbatim from this Fraser versus Brown decision about 40 years prior in Ohio. The idea that what goes on in the subsurface is so occult that we don't really know what's happening. And then also this idea that imposing any type of liability for water withdrawals would be something that stymies growth and development. And I think what we've seen, not just from experience in Texas, but really from experience all over the United States, is both of those propositions are just fundamentally false and very much deserve a rethink. And Ohio did this rethink. They maintained this system for about, I guess here, if I'm doing my math right, it'd be about 120 years, be roughly where Texas is now. In the Klein decision, you had, and I'll skip ahead here just so you can see some of the background to it. Basically, there were landowners who were dried up by a quarry's dewatering operation, and they sued over this, and the case made its way up to the Ohio Supreme Court. The defendants asked that the rule of capture, as it had existed for almost a century and a quarter prior, be applied. And the Ohio Supreme Court drew on a big body of law, fundamentally the same body of law that we looked at and I looked at in drafting this report, and came away with a few conclusions. They said that the rule of capture was often harsh. It caused uncertainty. It wasn't congruent or aligned with modern hydrological knowledge, and that was also a system that basically, if you had the might and the size to defend your groundwater property rights, you were in an advantaged position, but otherwise you were basically at the mercy of everyone else around you. And so what they did in response to this is they adopted the restatement second approach. And just in a nutshell, this assumes non-liability unless you do something that unreasonably causes harm to your neighbors. And there's different ways this can play out. You exceed a reasonable share of annual supply, or you start affecting hydrologically conjoined water sources. And I think one of the big questions as Ohio made this move is, how is this going to practically affect groundwater property rights? Well, lo and behold, 21 years later, the Ohio Supreme Court got to speak on the issue again. I think what we saw is it actually enhanced property rights. You went from something that was basically focused most of all on non-liability to something that actually focused on protecting your water rights by law, and it recognized rights to groundwater as a defensible property right. I think these protections would probably be even stronger in Texas because we already go a step further with our statute here and recognize a real private property ownership interest in groundwater. And so I think this is something, obviously nobody has a perfect view of the future, but when we look at the Ohio experience, it was a big transition. It was a significant leap that the court made, but it's been something that's actually enhanced property rights there. I'm running short on time, so I won't dwell on this. I'll post these slides up afterward for anybody who wants to see how the Ohio legislature came in subsequently and actually codified some definitions of reasonableness. What I want to turn to next is Michigan, because I think this one is extremely relevant as we think about this urban-rural interface that increasingly manifests itself in the Texas water space. And we have a whole line of cases in Michigan where we see reasonable use balancing evolve and be applied. And I think something that's really stands out in there is the courts didn't take an absolutist attitude of the kind that you often see when the rule of capture is applied. They balanced interests. For instance, if you have a city who is obtaining a water supply, but it's drying out neighboring landowners, they don't enjoin the city from not pumping, but they do ask that the city pay compensation so people can lower their wells or find alternative sources of water. They want to try to ensure maximal sustainable access to the resource. And I think this is something that is already congruent with what we do here in Texas, and really with the very congruent with the livelihoods and what many of you do day to day in your work governing water supplies here. So we'll skip this. I think the key point to take away is Central Texas is probably the battleground for this. I think you have outlier scenarios if we had a bad enough drought where Houston or Dallas become interested in the Carrizo, Wilcox, and some of the water resources deeper inside the triangle. I think a balancing approach also makes sense because when you look at how our use patterns are evolving in Texas, in the Water Development Board's latest state water plan amply reflects this, there's a greater and greater shift to non-fallowable uses. In a worst-case drought scenario, it's a tragedy when you have to fallow a farm field, but you can do it, but you can't fallow a city or factory in the same way. And groundwater is a critical source of supply for a lot of municipal systems scattered all around the state, not just in some of the bigger cities. I think we already see this implicitly reflected in planning when we see the difference between identified water needs and the needs that are actually met by the latest water plan. You notice that most of these very closely match, with the exception of irrigation. Now, and again, I apologize for compressing this a little bit here. As we look at Nebraska, there's a more limited application of the Restatement Second, and I think this is one that, particularly in Central Texas, in some of our areas with the springs, could be very relevant. And this was one where you had a conflict between upstream groundwater pumpers and a downstream surface water irrigator. And after a pretty significant fight, the Nebraska Supreme Court ultimately decided to apply the Restatement Second approach. And they took it's basically very riparian oriented. There's a strong flavor of this in both the explicit riparian and the groundwater portions of the Restatement Second. And what stood out at me when I looked at Nebraska's, the court's decision here, is when you see this idea of practicality of avoidance, adaptation, protecting of existing investments, it's basically who's the lowest cost avoider, how do we get there, and how do we protect existing investments? And I think Texas courts already have a lot of experience in this area because we've been doing this for 100 years and running in the oil and gas space through the accommodation doctrine. So it's something that's not massively new. I think to kind of leave you a bit of a takeaway flavor here in case you think I'm being a little too radical with some of the ideas I'm putting forth, is in the 1930s and early 1940s, Texas very strongly, there were many interests that very strongly considered making groundwater public property and having it accessible through permitting and prior appropriation. There was even an attorney general opinion, I believe, that dated from 1940. We saw some of the water-owning interest groups mobilize against that, and we had the 1949 legislative session, and many of your profession here today, I think, can very much trace its genesis to those events, but it gives you a sense of where we've gone before. This is Ivy Holt, who was really the mastermind of this legislation. He only served 2 terms, but ones whose impact still reverberates to this day. I guess the thought I'll leave you with, and this will channel a little bit of Hemingway here, is when Mike, who's a salesman, one of the main characters in his book, he's asked by somebody, well, how did you go bankrupt? He said, well, gradually, and then suddenly. I think a water crisis unfolds in much the same way. It starts gradually, it creeps and creeps and creeps. We kind of get used to where we are, and then you get into a place where there's a problem, and the workout from a water bankruptcy is not easy. It takes many years. Livelihoods are destroyed, economic values destroyed, and our future's put on a different trajectory. With that, I thank you for your time and attention. Be happy to take any questions.
A couple did come in on the app, and I'll just take, maybe we can keep the responses short, but I don't want to give short shrift to the folks who are
I'll keep them
submitting.
very.
So I'll read them to you real quick.
Absolutely.
Okay, the first one was, what would it mean for areas without a GCD if Texas no longer had the rule of capture?
So those areas, I think, is where this would probably be most easily applied. I think where it would be a little more complex is if you have a GCD that is not already managing along those lines. But I think if you're in one of these white spaces, it's both most easily applicable there. But if you were the person who was sitting in the catbird seat with the deep straw, you may be the most affected. It's probably the honest answer.
The other question that came in was, how does this happen? Is this the legislature? Is this the courts? How does that issue get before the Supreme Court?
So you just asked the topic of my next paper, which I'm already writing on. So I'm not going to foreshadow too much. I will say that there's precedent and examples from other states if the legislature doesn't move with expediency. If you get a court that's got the intestinal fortitude, there's probably some things that could be done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gabe.
Thank you, guys.